My husband and I have 5 kids and our 2 youngest are autistic, and this is a video, 12 signs that your child's probably not autistic. I've heard people say, oh, your child's not autistic, they're social. Or your child's not autistic, look, they're making eye contact. Those are myths. My son Simon, who's 4 years old, was diagnosed with level 1 autism with no intellectual delay, and he does both of those things really well. He's very social. He has lots of friends, and he loves going to preschool. And he has great eye contact. Our son Ezra, who's 8 years old, has apraxia of speech, autism level 3, and has ADHD. The examples that we'll be sharing today are from our home to yours, and all the home video are of Ezra and Simon. First sign, your child is very good at first impressions, especially with peers. First impressions are usually a pretty difficult situation to be in if you have social anxiety or if you have a hard time understanding people's social cues or reading their faces. So if you have a child in your classroom or at home who's just really good at first impressions with peers, then most likely they're probably not autistic. The second sign has a lot to do with the first, and that's if your child has a really easy time being social. It's not awkward. It's not difficult for them. They don't feel stressed or have anxiety whenever they need to be social. Now, I told you that Simon's very social. He is. But we've really had to teach him how to make friends. We've had to teach him how to read social cues, and I know as he grows up, he'll get even better at it, but this is not something that came natural to him. Ezra has a hard time with social situations. He's very overstimulated visually, and so if you're not a close family member or a friend at school that he knows really well, he will probably just avoid you. But that is a sign that your child is probably not autistic, and if they can be social again and again and again without much awkwardness, and they just seem to naturally figure it out, then they probably aren't autistic. Keep in mind, if your child is a little older, they could be masking their autistic traits to fit into society and to be accepted by friends in social situations. And that can be really dangerous for their mental health and be really difficult for them. And they can be super exhausted at the end of the day because they've been masking. And if you don't know what masking is, we actually made a video, 12 examples of autistic masking here. And it's especially helpful for teachers and parents to look at kids and notice, oh, my child's masking an autistic trait for some reason. And it's really important for adults to recognize that in kids because then you can help them understand what they're doing. So that's something to definitely look out for as a parent or caregiver. Sign 3 is if the child is really good at reading your facial expressions. So for example, if your child asks you a question and you're like, okay, the answer is obviously no, and you just look at them like, you don't even have to say anything, they can read your face. And so if your child just naturally reads your face and can communicate with you with facial expressions and can read yours as well, then that's a sign that they most likely aren't autistic. And if you disagree with any of these, please put it in the comments because I want to hear your opinion. I really do. Sign 4, your child doesn't fidget or stim. And if you don't know what stimming is, we have a video right here, 12 examples of autistic stimming. The stimming is a self-regulatory stimulating behavior, and it's very repetitive. Sometimes it's really obvious, and sometimes it's kind of a mind game. But anytime you fidget, tap a pen, tap your foot, shake your hands, rock back and forth, or do any number of repetitive movements that just helps your body regulate itself, then that is a stimulation. My kids will stim all the time. Before we knew that my son Simon was autistic, we noticed him stimming when we lived in an RV full time. Yes, we had 5 kids in an RV full time, and we visited all the national parks. And he would run from one side of the RV to the other. Now, if he was doing this in a house, it probably wouldn't have been that big of a deal. But the fact that we were all in this tiny RV, and it was actually a really big RV, but it was tiny for a house. And he would run back and forth for up to an hour, often throwing himself onto people or onto furniture. At the end of the day, he had all this energy that he just had to get out, and that was the way that he would stim. We had some crazy times in that RV, and we share regularly of our unique normal, so please consider subscribing. To have a diagnosis of autism, you have to have issues in 3 categories. The first one is social, the second is communication, and the third is repetitive and restrictive behaviors and interests. So stimming falls under the repetitive behavior. If your child doesn't have any kind of repetitive behavior, they probably aren't autistic because they have to have an issue in that category to get a diagnosis of autism. But keep in mind, there might be stimming that goes on that maybe you just don't notice. Sign 5, if your child is not a picky eater, they're fine with trying new foods, new textures. If they have no problem trying those foods and eating them, then they're probably not autistic. This is kind of a tricky one because most kids and toddlers especially are picky anyway. They have their foods that are their favorites. But if your child isn't picky at all, then they probably aren't autistic. You've had a lot. You want some? You want some? Now, our son Ezra loves different kinds of foods. He's actually really not that picky. He has his favorites like chicken nuggets and cheese, but he still has a hard time with different textures. You can't give him peanut butter without him gagging and throwing it up. So beware of the textures. Weird different textures of food really bother both of our sons. Sign 6. They don't ignore you. They interact very naturally with you. Most neurotypical kids and toddlers will not ignore you. Once they hear you, they'll look up. They'll respond. When they hear their name, then they'll give you eye contact. So if you feel like your kid is constantly ignoring you and they're not a teenager, then they could be autistic. Now keep in mind, these aren't for sure things. That's why I'm doing 12 of them. Remember, autism spectrum disorder is a spectrum. It's super wide. So when you've met one person or one kid with autism, you've only met one person or one kid with autism. Both of our boys are super different. Sometimes their behaviors are even opposite from each other. What I've learned from that as a mother is that I need to support them in different ways. Ezra is very social, but he's social in his own way. He'll actually come back to back and sit next to me and sometimes play with my hands. So he wants to make that connection, but because he's overstimulated visually, it's hard for him to look me in the eye. So I never make him do that, right? I never expect my children to mask their autistic traits or try and look like they're not autistic. They need a safe place where they feel unconditional love, and I feel like they can thrive more in that environment. We talk about this in our ASD club, where we meet weekly on a video chat. Click the link below to sign up, and I can't wait to see you next week. And if you're looking for more one-on-one coaching, there's a link in the description for that as well. Sign 7, they are totally fine with change in routine. A lot of kids on the spectrum have a hard time if last minute their routine is changed. For example, if you wake up and you say, we're gonna go to the museum, and then they get excited, you get in the car, and then you get there and the museum is closed. Most kids are gonna be disappointed, but most neurotypical kids can be distracted and say, hey, we're gonna go to the park instead. And if your child is completely fine with that and it doesn't bother them very much that there's a change in routine, then they're probably not autistic. My kids love routines, and if it's changed last minute, usually they have a really hard time with that. Just last week, I put Ezra in the car, and we usually drive to his autism school. It's an amazing school. We love it, and he loves it too. So he's excited to go to a school, and then we don't go to a school. We go to a doctor's appointment instead. He had such a hard time at that doctor's appointment. He just couldn't get over the fact that we didn't go to school. He wasn't able to calm down or sit down for about 2 hours because I completely changed his routine, and that wasn't very nice of me. What did we miss? Put in the comments below if you have another sign that a child's probably not autistic. Sign 8, uses eye contact to socialize and get your attention. My son Simon is actually really good at eye contact. When he was little and a toddler and a baby, he would always look at us when we would talk to him. But I remember when the doctor was doing the assessment for autism, and he pointed out that he wasn't using eye contact to get my attention. He wasn't using eye contact as a tool to socialize. For example, if I held something that he really wanted, he would look at what he wanted. A neurotypical child will usually make the connection very quick and naturally that they should look you in the eye to get what they want. Now, of course, this doesn't mean you can't teach a child to do that. My son Simon learned really fast that if he wants something in my hand, he'll look me in the eye. But that was not natural for him, and it took a few months for him to learn how to do that. Sign 9, fine with transitions. If your child is just super chill, like you can transition me from one thing to another. We can play trains, and then we can go over here and play dolls, and then we can play Legos, and you can read me a book, and I'm totally fine with transitioning those things. Then they're probably not autistic. Especially if they're doing something that they really love doing and you're interrupting them saying, hey, it's dinner time. One thing that I do with my kids, whether autistic or not, is I will tell them, hey, in 5 minutes, it'll be time to stop what you're doing and then it'll be dinner time. And that does help, but still it's hard for my autistic kids to transition out of whatever they're doing, especially if they really love it, especially if it's an intense interest. And that actually brings us to our next sign. Sign 10 is that they have no intense interests. Now, most people, kids, adults, teenagers, will have something that they're really interested in. But I'm talking about intense interests. Simon will tuck my ear off about certain things that he likes and that he's interested in. But most neurotypical kids will have a wide variety and a broad spectrum of different things that they like. And also it'll change. Sometimes they'll like one cartoon and then they see their friend with a different cartoon on their shirt and they're like, oh, maybe I like that cartoon now. Generally speaking, kids that are neurotypical care more about what's trending and have more of a broad array of interests. So if your child's like that, where one day he's into one thing, the next day he's into something else, and he changes his mind about all the many different interests he has, then he's probably not autistic. Sign 11 is no sensory sensitivities. This is a really big one for our family. When I am cooking in the kitchen and my son Simon walks in, he will smell whatever I'm cooking. And even if it's a good smell to me, like lasagna or Italian dressing, he will not be able to be in the room. He'll go out on the deck and he'll have to eat in a different room. Ezra will have to eat in a different room if we're cooking eggs in the morning. This happened in this video where we just talked about morning routine and we walk you through our morning routine, and we were not expecting this to happen. Simon woke up first and we made him eggs. He was sitting there eating his eggs, and Ezra came in and Ezra actually gagged because of the smell of the egg, and he threw up, and then he had to eat his cereal in his bedroom. And so that was sad, but that was just an example of a sensory sensitivity. If your child is not sensitive to smell, not sensitive to touch, is fine with the tags in their shirt, and is fine if there's bright lights, and is totally fine in the mall with all the noises and the loud people, and is not bothered if there's an overload of sensory input around them, then they're probably not autistic. But make sure that they're not masking, because they could be. Sign 12, the last sign, is if your child has had no trouble communicating at all, if your child's communication has never been odd, robotic, unique, maybe too mature for their age, or they've had difficulty with communicating, then they probably aren't autistic. Both Ezra and Simon had a really hard time learning to communicate. It took a lot longer for them to communicate, and Ezra is actually still nonverbal, even though he can use an ACC device and communicate through his iPad, and he's learning how to spell, so we're really excited about that. Here's 12 signs of autism in a toddler, and here's our autism playlist. And remember, if you have an autistic child, you're in good company.